Peter. It's our November 18th weekly radio address, I just got back from Iowa late last night, so I'm a little out of sorts today, and actually this is going to be kind of a short program considering this plethora of stuff I always come back to when I get back from traveling. It's only going to be an hour program. It's mainly going to be focused on questions. And, that's basically it. It's been back-to-back. Iowa was a lot of fun. It was a tremendous environment, a lot of open-minded people, and I'm getting that video up as fast as I possibly can, and I want to apologize again for the webcast that went down. It's just one of those things. There's only so much I can do when the integrity of such things like that are contingent upon the space and everything else, meaning the hall. They didn't have the integrity. Their firewall was messing everything up, and it didn't work out, unfortunately. It was a big bummer, and because I always like to keep that live presence for stuff like this. So a few quick announcements. I've been getting some emails. I think some of you guys might have heard that Jock had to go to the hospital briefly when he was in Ohio, but don't worry about it. I spoke with Roxanne earlier, and he's doing great. In fact, he bounced right back and was talking to people in Ohio right after he got out. So I just hope everyone doesn't feel panicked or anything like that. Jock's not going anywhere. Important point, I think some of you might be aware of this, the Venus Project is attempting a world tour through organizers at the Zeitgeist Movement UK. And essentially I want to throw out there for anyone listening in other countries and you would like to facilitate the Venus Project coming to your area, it has to start in that manner. I suggest that you email Heather Odom at thevenusproject.com. That's HEATHERODOM at thevenusproject.com if you would like to request them to visit and hopefully facilitate that in some way. And that's a very exciting thing. That would be absolutely tremendous to get that type of exposure for this information. And what else was there? I think, there's a Ventrilo meeting that's going to happen at, I believe, 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, if I remember correctly. And unfortunately, I can't make it. And this is why this particular show is only going to be an hour because as I mentioned, I'm unfortunately way behind in a number of things, even domestic things. I'm sure most of you might imagine I have a complex domestic life. And unfortunately, I have to run around and do a lot of rather aggravating things, to be frank, but I'm not going to go into all of that. But there will be a Ventrilo meeting today that's going to talk about 2010 Zeitgeist Day to bounce around ideas. And I'm really excited to see what kind of ideas everyone comes up with as far as things to do in their region, as far as activist issues, as far as spreading information, anything, flash mobs. Just basically compile a massive list, and Dark Dancer is going to help with compiling this information. Again, I apologize for not being there, but the next meeting I will certainly be there, and we can cover some of the more fine points, the fine points of this and things that we can start implementing and start organizing this. This event day will be much more powerful, I think, than the prior 2 years, naturally because we do have thriving chapters now, and that's going to be very, very unique. So I believe that's all the things that I needed to address, and essentially this program is going to be about answering questions once again, and next program I'll have Jacques and Roxanne on. They just got back late last night as well, so I didn't want to burden them with coming back on because they need to relax a little bit. So let's go right through this. Number one, there has been a lot of debate about genetic engineering on so-called moral grounds, but does it not make sense that the Venus Project Zeitgeist Movement's perspective, does it not make sense for the Venus Project and the Zeitgeist Movement to pursue this avenue? Could humans not be classified as organic machines? Why not start using our science and technology to start improving the human machine? I realize that this is probably considered a touchy subject, but it certainly is an important one, and perhaps it is also our best hope. Okay, well, I think what you're talking about probably falls in line with a very controversial medium called transhumanism. People like Ray Kurzweil advocate the speculation that in time humans will be kind of obsolete in their processes because of the exponential increase of technological development, specifically computerization development, artificial intelligence, and things of such. He calls it the countdown to singularity. And I think, generally speaking, not even considering that, we expand ourselves with technology all the time. A simple Simple glasses are an expansion of technology. We've used that example numerous times. Technology is clothing, technology are contacts, hearing aids. Whatever we have to do to improve ourselves, I think, is absolutely viable. Of course, it gets very science fiction oriented. People get very terrified of these things. They feel it's unnatural. But technology is an ongoing thing, and I think we'll look back, we'll look in the future, we'll have all sorts of things that are connected to us and not have the romanticism of denial to think that it's unnatural in some way. I mean, they already have people that have Parkinson's disease, and they have chips that are outside their cranium, if I remember correctly, that can be updated remotely. In other words, they can have software updates remotely. And what they do is they control certain attributes of the brain that might lead to negative elements that are associated with Parkinson's disease. I completely agree. I get it. It is a testy subject, but there's no reason we should be afraid of such progress. Number 2, there was a question posted last week by a high school student looking for direction. I think it is very important that the movement speak to the younger demographic. Can you address this? They are staring the stark realities of our current system in the face with serious decisions to make and are looking for direction. Perhaps there should be a special section of information for this group on the website. I would say maybe we could make packages that are targeted towards universities. I've often wanted to do that. I think the chapters should have a university association. If I had, in the New York chapter, I would hope that they would start contacting universities. Any chapter should be attempting to integrate with universities because that is the hub of education in an academic sense. I completely agree. Having just been in Iowa at a very progressive university, a very interesting university, it's amazing to see the possibility of the so-called university awareness where people in groups can come together, and since they're already there anyway, they might as well have something to show for it as far as the movement. I think it would be fantastic. Not only chapters, but university chapters, if you will. I think these are all kind of in the pipeline, and I certainly advocate it. So I hope that answers your question. I absolutely would want to engage younger people. These are things that will be ongoing, and I completely agree. Number 3, I have been thinking about getting shovels to the ground, how getting shovels to the ground in gesture could be a great way to spread awareness. For example, aquaponics center build and maintained by local chapters. Aquaponics center built and maintained by local chapters is the way it should read. And they would partake in local events with their superfood and use the medium to connect to people and spread awareness. Then as membership flows, I think he means, we can start developing infrastructures, inventory, and local resources to send to the eventual central database. Okay, let me step back a second to make sure I understand. Okay, yeah, getting your hands involved in elements that would be relevant to our work, of course, is extremely important. If you do work in aquaponics or hydroponics or anything like that, working to develop sustainable attributes, sustainable parameters, anything that would denote connectivity to sustainability and efficiency, and of course abundance production, is certainly in line with what we're talking about. So yes, by all means, I think these things should be pursued, and there's actually some tremendous work that's been done. I'm actually very much behind, I will openly admit, because every time I go and I search for these types of things, there's so much new information. There's so many people doing tremendously fantastic work especially in regard to agriculture and sustainable agriculture, and just ingenious methods of using the environment in a symbiotic way. So, by all means, I think everyone should be involved in those. As far as the larger order issue of how it pertains to a resource-based economy, there are components, and eventually they would be applied. So I hope that answers your question. As far as the eventual central database, I'm going to interpret that meaning that this could be a systems orientation, and the attributes that you're denoting would be implied in the system. And of course, if you research our materials, you know that everything we do is essentially based on a systems approach, systems theory. Number 4. Hi, PJ. I was wondering if you can clarify for me the movement's viewpoint on the conditioning of the individual by the institutions of society. The Zeitgeist Movement premise seems to me that man, apart from his so-called decision-making faculties, is nothing other than what the society, the environment, conditions him to be. Therefore, Jacques states that man is nothing but the product of his conditioning. Society must be carefully, scientifically organized to condition him in the, quote, right way. In other words, the individual exists for the society rather than society being a reflection of individual action. For me, this rings false. Okay, this is a long one. I'm going to just pause right here to make sure I clarify a little bit, because there's a second half to this, which I'll read in a moment. Basically, what you're saying is correct, but the individual exists for the society rather than society being a reflection of the individual action. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. I think while we are conditioned, there are interactions that are made, and I think that society is really a combination, I suppose, of conditioned attributes that has come from the environment, and then actions taken to groom society. I mean, we did create society. It's all conditioning one way or another, but I suppose the differentiation I'm trying to make is in line with something like a chicken and egg type thing. I hope I understand what you mean, but generally speaking, what you're saying is correct, but you say this rings false, that society, the individual exists for society rather than society being a reflection of the individual action. I would say that's basically kind of paradoxical, and it's not exactly, it's not one or the other. It's a combination. But let me continue with your question. The function of society is to raise man in freedom, to uncondition him, not completely control him. Okay, let me pause right there. We're not attempting to just, well, if you look at yourself as a biological machine, you see that you are susceptible to influence. Every word I'm saying has been taught to me, and we've gone over this for anyone that's followed this particular notion. Meaning that you are conditioned perpetually. You're conditioned by your genetic propensities, meaning what you're born with, essentially, what's culminated as you grow, and you're also conditioned intellectually by the world around you. So it's you're using some terminology that I can't quite understand. You say that the function of society is to raise man in freedom. Okay, well, that's an interpretation. That's not the function of all society. You couldn't generalize society in such a way. Many societies that have occurred throughout history is not to raise man in freedom. It's to restrict man. These are the basis of most societies that we've seen, because power establishments tend to be the hub of social influence, at the hub of social influence, and of course they choose to maintain their power. Again, we might be lost in semantics here, but nevertheless I think it's important to clarify these points. But let me continue your point, and I'll continue from that sentence. The question continues, quote, the function of society is to raise man in freedom, to uncondition him, not completely control him, to give him the tools and resources to fashion his life as he best sees fit, providing that he does not infringe on the freedom of others. Quote, the application of the scientific method for social concern, control, synonymous with domination, dependency, etc. I don't like the sound of that. Okay, pause right there. He says, the application of the scientific method for social control. It's, first of all, the phrase isn't social control. It's the application of the scientific method for social concern. And so there's a difference in that approach. The inevitability is that control is a byproduct of the social conditioning. You control people by way of conditioning them to think in a specific way. You impose values on them. Governments have been imposing nationalism, have been imposing religion for so long, and that's how you control the masses, is you keep them thinking in a way that's supportive of the system at large. And I would just say outright that that's exactly what would happen in a resource-based economy, except it's not imposed. It's in line with natural law, if you want to use a terminology like that. It's in line with science, and it's in line with the goal of sustainability of the species. And this is a very important point. People would be culminated in this new society, but they'd be culminated based on values that lead to sustainability, not the narrow self-interest values that are dominant today. People are still going to be products of culture, and that's just the way things are. And I hope that's clear, and I hope I'm not extending this farther than what your original context is. But let me continue, because you have a very long aspect here. He continues, quote, you keenly note the military's ability to brainwash a person when the movement purports a technological, educational, and social system scientifically, materially, even linguistically geared towards the control of the individual. Is that not total brainwashing? Absolutely, it's brainwashing, but you don't use that term. It's conditioning, brainwashing, conditioning, whatever you want to use. You have to accept the reality that you are a conditioned being, and that the concept of free will is limited only to your intellectual tool set, the options given to you by your environment. So if you want to use that aggressive term, fine. We're all brainwashed. That's just the way things are. Everybody is brainwashed, whether they're in an altruistic state of mind or whether they're in a controlled state of mind, whether they're in an oppressive state of mind. And let me continue. Continue quote, I am probably misunderstanding your use of the words control and condition. Perhaps you can clarify them. See words like individual creative action, freedom, unconditioning, non-judgmental thinking. These are the words that I like. Okay, here's what I would add to that. I believe when a child is born and culminated, there's an element to the child that seems to be relatively natural, and I can't definitively prove this, but there's a curiosity. I always loved how Buckminster Fuller talked about this. There's a genuine curiosity. An organism, you see it in almost all organisms. There's a curiosity. If you have, say, a cat and it's a kitten, it's going to start to investigate its environment. There seems to be a natural propensity for investigation by organisms in their environment. And the curiosity and learning processes, that would be considered creative, I suppose, in my mind. But all the information that they take in starts to culminate a particular awareness, starts to culminate a particular worldview. And if the society is rigidly controlled, meaning that the state or what have you limits information, then they can limit the exposure and hence the inferential possibility, if you will, of the organism that is being exposed, which is in the environment suffering the exposure. I hate to sound so intellectual on that. Let me try to explain that in a different way. Basically, you can't escape the environmental condition. So we want to create an environmental condition where the curiosity of people can be expanded upon in a very positive sense for the sake of society as a whole. There is a very target aspect to it, and it has to do, in my mind, with sustainability. And there's a huge conversation on this. I could go on many different tangents, but what I will say is that society today, the conditioning we see today, is not based on sustainability. It's based on conflict and narrow self-interest. The only way the human species is going to be able to sustain itself is by learning to work together, and I think that can be definitively proven. If we're always in conflict, we're always going to have that possibility of destroying ourselves. Therefore, we're not sustainable. So we have to learn to work together, and we have to thus create an environment and value orientations that support that. So people that are born into the new system, they are naturally cultured to want to have these values of cooperation, of seeking sustainable elements, of wanting to see progress, and not just all the selfish, narrow aspects we see today. So a number of different points you touched upon. I hope that makes sense. To summarize it very cleanly, we're all susceptible to conditioning. You can call it brainwashing if you want, but the goal is to alter that conditioning so it's actually supportive of the species, not negative, where it's going to lead to our destruction. Number 5. Let's see. Dear Peter, would it be valuable, in your opinion, to get the Zeitgeist Movement, Venus Project information to influential scientists that have openly displayed thinking against current institutions? Well, obviously, by all means. And there are people that I attempt to talk to. I even brought this question up to Roxanne, I think a few conversations ago, and they've tried their best to engage scientists. There's plenty of scientists that agree with certain aspects of it. But once you get into larger social issues, it becomes very, very taboo. Very taboo. They don't want to address the monetary system. It's just too much. So that's really the barrier. And I think as things continue to break down, I'm sure some of you might have noticed that there are now 49 million people starving in America, the wealthiest country in the world, evidently. 49 million people going hungry in this country. The stratification is continuing. There's going to be a point where the scientists, they say, you know what, we have to do something different. We're going to have to start paying attention to the social system. And I really hope that other scientists, like-minded individuals that really care, will come forward in every discipline. Number 6. I was wondering if you could elaborate on how the Zeitgeist Movement Venus Project compares to or differs from the technocracy movement of the early 30s. It seems to me that a lot of their basic tenets are very similar to the goals of, to our goals, Better yet, is the Zeitgeist Movement Venus Project in fact advocating a form of what's that word? Cyberocracy. Cyberocracy. I've never heard that term before. Cyberocracy. Interesting. Well, for the second question, are we advocating a form of cyberocracy? If I can piece those terms together, I think I've never looked that word up, but assuming what you're talking about, a cybernated form of system, a systems approach in a cybernated form, machines running society, at least as tools, obviously, as we talk about endlessly, then I would say yes, I would agree with that, but I would have to double-check that definition, so don't quote me on that. And as far as the technocracy movement, Mr. Fresco was in technocracy. There are attributes that he certainly liked, but there are attributes that he certainly didn't. What I didn't like about technocracy when I reviewed their material is that they tend to have a nationalistic propensity. There was maybe that was cultural back in for the material that I had read. But there is a connection there. But I don't like to get mixed up with words and organizations. Let's just follow the train of thought. Let's make sure that the train of thought is in line. I think Jacques has developed actual tangible solutions in a way that the people of technocracy, at least from my exposure, have not. It becomes more theoretical. And there's also a system of credits and these other things that were organized in technocracy. And again, I don't know if they're still in place, but they do differ from what we're doing. We're based exclusively on resource management and distribution and sustainable approaches holistically through a systems approach. There might be attributes of technocracy that are in conflict with that. But yes, there is a certain connection by all means. As I said, Jacques was a part of that movement, but he left, I believe, because he didn't agree with some of the aspects of the person who was running it. In fact, there were some racial attributes that were in play, where certain people were actually not considered equal. They were considered inferior or not able to do certain things intellectually. So, number 7. What would happen if something that is abundant caused problems by its production? This includes health problems, environmental problems, and, quote, moral problems. To the trains you mentioned in Zeitgeist Addendum, sure, I can see how speed would be very beneficial to travel. However, using my limited knowledge, it seems that airplanes would be far more efficient in resources, for an airplane does not need a large track and can go in all directions. I guess that we would have to do the math, but are magnetic trains more resource efficient and energy efficient? I understand how airplanes are very detrimental to the environment, but should we focus on trains or making airplanes green? What would be more effective? I think it's not one that is it's a decision that's made and it's a decision that's arrived at, and I think it's a classic example of arriving at decisions. You gauge the resources required for each. You gauge the technological capacity as we know it. You gauge the energy required for each, of course, and then you gauge the negative retro actions. Obviously, planes can fly in three-dimensional space. Maglev trains would have to go straight. Either they could be underground, they could be underwater, they could be above water. But the difference is, I think, is the speed and the cleanliness of the maglev train and the energy usage. If you can build an airplane that is, well, I don't know, electric or runs on solar panels, if that's possible, well, then that could be incorporated. It's simply a matter of what works and what is the most, quote, sustainable, and that's it. Sustainable, of course, meaning what is the least energy usage, what is the most efficient, and I don't think I need to explain that. So it would work itself out based on the tools that are there. But there's a plus and minus to each one, and I can completely see your point. It would just be a matter of evaluating all the attributes that are relevant to each medium and deciding which is more efficient, which would be a tangible, objective process, ultimately. Number 8. Peter, I commend you on your determination. What are you doing to ensure your safety? In one of your earlier radio shows, you said you have received threats. And when taking a look at history of our country and others, it shows that some people are executed. I understand that Jacques plays a major role in leadership also. I hate to say this, but he will not be around. he might not be around for that much longer. Okay, I see where you're going with this. Where can we go for guidance and continuation? What I'd like to say to anybody who worries about things like that is what if everything vanished tomorrow? What if the site was disappeared tomorrow? What would you do? This is the kind of thinking that I think needs to be incorporated. What if I vanished off the face of the earth and Jacques and Roxanne vanished? It would be up to you to begin to do whatever you could in the same way that we have, to learn and to expand and to research and to communicate. And I think that's really what I would say to that. I mean, as far as my own safety, I'm generally cautious, but I'm not paranoid either. There's only so much you can do. I don't really believe in security in the sense of the traditional application. I believe the highest form of security is to solve the actual source of the problem. Now, that obviously doesn't mean that someone couldn't run up to me and do something to me, but I tend to navigate myself in groups when I travel, at least in events, and, I've never had an aggressive experience personally. Of course, I've gotten lots of negative communications, but, it's just not something I worry about. But the point being is that everyone out there should really think about what would happen if everything kind of disappeared based on what we have now. How would you pick up the pieces? It's very important that this, again, is a holographic type of thing. If you're just kind of following everything we're doing in a general participation, that's not enough. You need to be able to do as I do, in the sense that if someone pins you down, you need to have all the parameters under your belt. When someone talks to you and they say, well, the monetary system is just a means of exchange, it's not really something that has any detriment. It's the poor people. It's the ethics of people. They don't understand. You have to be able to say, no, the system is reinforcing elements that people are acting upon for their own personal gain. Therefore, there's a reason why their behavior is such. The monetary system is not just a medium of exchange. And even though it is a medium of exchange, there's a reason why the exchange actually has to occur, because of scarcity. If there was no scarcity, there'd be no reason for a medium of exchange. And hence scarcity is money, hence people have to fight for money, and hence differential advantage, gaming strategy, hence dishonesty, hence corruption, hence the world you see around you. You have to be able to speak like that and break it down so when these arguments come up, which you'll find they come up over and over and over again, the same arguments will come up over and over again, and eventually you'll get good enough to address all of them. And they will just either be frustrated or they'll be willing to accept your explanations and the logic of them. And that's really what I'd like to say about that. Number 9. I understand that when the technology-based infrastructure is used, that there will be no added incentive for people to want power, but I worry that at first, when these systems are being introduced, the power motivations will transfer over from the previous system and be mixed with the Venus Project system. When the systems adapted by these power-motivated people could keep going by the When the systems adapted by these power-motivated people could keep going by the people that this system aids, and with the technology it becomes possible to maintain this power without the backing of the people, would it not be more effective to completely tear down the old system before introducing a new one? Well, I guess in a perfect world, you have all of humanity say, we're going to stop right now. Let's renovate. And we bulldoze and mine all of our old cities. We get everyone to come together happily, and we start fresh. That would be, of course, great. Obviously, that's not going to happen, as you very well know when you talk about the power establishment. So yes, the old system is going to have to deteriorate before change occurs. It's a biosocial pressure. I think we all recognize that historically, most change comes from problems. In fact, creativity, in my mind, is a product of problems that occur in society. So the power elite, well, they will have less and less to stand on. They will have less and less reinforcement. When money is not a problem, when money is not respected, when these institutions are no longer respected, when people stop participating, not only is it going to alter the system itself, because these institutions, again, are not being supported, meaning they're not getting the monetary reinforcement constantly to keep their power bases. But I believe human psychology, the people themselves will undergo change. I think that there's really, each person has a certain malleability. There's a lot of sickness out there, but I can see how people could be turned around, see how people that have been motivated by their greed could finally kind of be turned around away from that. There would be no support. They would feel the guilt would impede. A new value system would slowly start to culminate. And I think as time moves forward As generations move forward, this becomes more and more prevalent. People are born into a new society. They have no reinforcement for these things. Now, I understand what you're actually asking. Will the power structure try to grab hold of something like this? And this is asked to me all the time. Once the monetary system is removed, there's absolutely no grounds for that. Once the public understands and has an interconnection to the system based on what we advocate, which is a true democracy, the election of ideas, not the election of people, integrated, people participate through these computerized systems. I talked at length on this issue in Iowa, and when I get the video up, you can reference that to understand how this particular participation works. At that stage, not to mention the redundancy of the system itself, I see very little options for anybody to come in and grab it and try to take hold of it, because there's really no method to do so. And if someone that aberrated actually did, they could be removed very, very quickly. They could be found and removed very, very quickly. I say that arbitrarily because it's a loose notion. But the monetary system facilitates power monopoly. People can acquire more money, and then the more power they have, and that's just the stepping ladder that occurs. And that's it. So you have to keep that in mind. That tool is extremely important to this. That doesn't mean that solves everything immediately, but it would solve, I believe, 80 to 90% of most of the problems that we see across the board. Let's see here. Number 10. Is it true that the Venus Project believes that we have to wait until a total collapse of the monetary system before we can build our own cities? That is contingent upon, that is built with the prior question, I think, and the answer is not entirely. We certainly hope not, but the city's going to, and also it's not about their own cities, it's about the social design, not just cities. The collapse is pending, and it will continue. I have very little reservations about the fact that things are just going to continue to get worse. I can't rationalize how it can get better at this stage, and there are many, many attributes to that. It's a different paradigm that's happening now from many angles. But we don't want total collapse. I don't want to see complete suffering. That's not what I want. But I also know that that's how people are motivated. That's the whole point of the Zeitgeist Movement, is to attempt to ease this, to be the buffer, to be the pillow, so people know where to go. If they don't know where to go, then the system will just reinvent itself in some other new despotic way, and more suffering will occur. Number 11. I really think you should stress in the next movie the enormous possibility of starting a third world war if we do not move out of what we're doing fast. People must see what is the reality, to get frightened to a certain level so that they can begin to seriously pay attention. I understand your angle, and as far as the third world war, I'm not a prophet, but well, as far as the pattern's concerned, we've had continual wars, world war, who knows? If resources to continue to do what they're doing, especially with the major powers, if they do not apply larger order technology to solve these problems, then the natural gravitation is war. And I think it's certainly possible, but I don't know. I don't know. It's one of those things that is certainly important to consider. As far as scaring people, we try not to just blatantly scare people, but people should understand the positive. They should understand what is possible versus what is possible in a positive sense. Let me state that again. They should look at what is possible in a negative sense versus what is possible in a positive sense. I believe with nanotechnology, we could create an atomic bomb the size of a golf ball, 1,000 times the power of Hiroshima's bomb. That is a reality. We could also have construction mechanisms that could create a pure abundance molecularly. It's like, as I use this quote often by Carl Sagan, it's almost as though there is a God, and he gives us these tools, and he says, okay, you can either destroy yourselves or you can work to make a better world. The atomic bomb was a classic example of this. You have atomic energy, which has lots of possibilities for creating an abundance, creating energy abundance, and utilizing, doing many different things, because it was a source of energy. But we used it to destroy a whole city. And the repercussions of that have been absolutely insane when you think about what we really could do to ourselves if the advanced technologies are used for the worst. So I think those are all very important things to bring up. And in the new film, I will show what could happen with these advancements in technology in a negative sense. If the Pentagon is always the first to get the highest forms of technology, And it is just absolutely horrific to think about what could be possible with some of the new things that are coming forward. I'm certainly terrified. I think if the public does understand that, I agree with you, they'll be more motivated for change. It's far beyond nuclear weapons at this point. There are some tremendous things that could occur that would make the nuclear bomb look like a baseball bat. So anyway, number 12. Hello, Peter. When I hear you talk about there no longer being any private property in the new system, it somewhat concerns me. I understand when you talk about boycotting big corporations with major pieces of property, but my main concern is for the average citizen with only a few acres. I know there will be many people, myself included, who would much rather stay on their land and homestead, producing all their own food and power, and being as self-sufficient as possible, mainly just relying on the new system to get new supplies and technologies. There will be a place for people like this in the Venus Project. Will there be a place for people like this in the Venus Project? How will their home on a few acres be viewed as far as property rights is concerned? Thank you. I think you're combining some ideas here that are not quite up to date. In other words, the private property aspect has to do with the reality that we're working in a systems approach to give everyone access to everything, to eliminate the need for protection, which is known as property. If someone wants to have a farm and they want to have things built into their home, I see no reason why they wouldn't be able to do that. But you have to factor in the larger city complex and what the whole point of the city is. The whole point is to relieve people of that type of problem, to relieve people of that type of interaction. No one, unless they really want to, would really have a need to have their own farm because it's built into the city complex. It's built into the global system. They have access to what they need. So there's greenhouses that are built around. If you go and investigate the city systems, automated monitoring of resource development, agriculture, and it's available for all. So there's really no reason for these types of notions that you talk about. I hope that makes sense because I think you haven't quite looked at what we're describing. As far as freedom to pursue things like that, there's no reason why someone couldn't have the freedom to cultivate their own crops if they wanted to. There's no reason for that. They can't sell them. There's no money. It's up to them. I think it'd be more efficient for them to rely on the systems that have been developed, because that would be the highest optimization. You'd have the most people thinking about it, the most people applying new information. So it would become, I guess, a romantic notion if someone wanted to have their own private farm for fun, which is fun. So I hope that answers your question. Number 13. Hi, Peter. In a new city, how would animals have access to it? Okay. Let me continue. There are deer and elk and squirrels, etc., that enter our current cities. That enter our current cities. Would they still be in the new cities, and how would that affect the city? I think the management of non-domesticated animals would exist similar to what we see today. The difference is that we would have no reason for deforestation anymore. We'd have no reason to keep abusing the environment. So things could return back to the pristine, natural culmination, natural development that is, quote, natural. The rainforest would have all the species that are consistent without the constant destruction from man-made development because of our usage of old techniques such as wood for many things that we don't even need wood for. So, if you look at the circular city outside of the city, actually it goes back to Jacques Fresco's interview with Larry King. He said outside the cities, everything returns to nature. And if we have problems with bears, humane things can be created to deal with any kind of problem that would emerge. If that's actually your question, I mean, animals, the nature would return to what nature is. So I'm not going to belabor that. Number 14. Peter, please respond to the following argument against the system. Quote, the problem with our current system, as with any other, is not one of money. The people behind the curtain, as they are often called, do not need more money. They already have control over printing presses. What motivates them is power. A resource-based system does not eliminate that desire. If anything, it enhances the power elite by making it difficult for ordinary people to protect themselves with savings. Oh, yeah, this is the same old nonsensical, ethical, corrupt human being argument that we hear over and over and over again. The missing link that this individual is denoting is the fact the power elite are human beings and reinforced by their environment. While I do understand there are old school secret societies that are in existence, we know George Bush was culminated in a very negative Skull and Bones at Yale. His grandfather owned a Nazi money laundering bank. There's some very sick attributes of elitism that you can track in the history of many people, but it's still conditioned. And that's the point. I'm not saying, obviously without money there's still going to be power and ego issues. Yes, that is manifest of the culture. But it's absolutely asinine to assume that that's just going to carry on forever. That's a Alex Jones idea. That's a superstitious idea, rejecting the fundamentals of human behavior reinforcement. So that's all I would say to that. You can't assume that's just going to continue forever unless you have proof definitively that in our biological condition that is prevalent, and there's no evidence of that. We are culminated by scarcity. We behave based on reinforcements that continue to be reinforced in a positive way for our own self-interest, even if it's negative to society. This new structure would remove all of that. Also, they mentioned that it would make make it easier for the power elite because it would be more difficult for ordinary people to protect themselves with savings. I have no idea how. That's a very convoluted concept. People don't protect themselves with savings. People are hindered by the financial system. Just because they have savings just means they're just a little bit more well off. It's actually the reverse. It's less negativity, not more positivity. So the monetary system, again, is a stepladder. It's used by those that have inside information, if you will, that have interconnectivities to the power structure, the, quote, establishment, and they use it to manipulate everything in the world for their own gain. Once the monetary system is removed and a new system is implemented by people that actually think, that are engaging, not just allowing some rogue group to try and implement something, but that these things can be warded against. And they're really not even worth thinking about. We have to move in this direction one way or another, or we're going to self-destruct. Are there going to be negative problems with people jockeying for power in the transition? Obviously, because we have the baggage of the old system that's in occurrence. So, I hope that clarifies the ignorance of that individual's statement. Number 15. Dear Peter, have you heard of the Orion Project? It is an organization created to transform the current energy, environmental, and social crises into a world of sustainability and enlightened abundance. Seems like they have a similar goal. Okay, there's a three-part question here, actually. For that, yes, I have heard of the Orion Project, and unfortunately I haven't had a chance to really investigate everything they're doing, but from the website, the materials I've read and the emails I've gotten, it certainly looks very, very positive. And I certainly, this might be one of the organizations that we can think about interacting with for Zeitgeist Day, Venus Project Symposium. I'm trying to get other organizations that, in one part or another, are in support of attributes of what we talk about, because there's many components, as we've addressed before. So I'll be researching that more so as I investigate all of this stuff. And I also might be interviewing other third-party organizations for the new film that are engaged in specific attributes that are, again, under the umbrella of all the things that we talk about. And that actually goes to your other question, what are some of the topics and content of Zeitgeist 3? Basically, as I said before, Zeitgeist Addendum threw out many things at the second half, that many things about what the Venus Project represents. In the third film, I am going to work to expand on all of the most critical components, if you will, of the system and show how it's feasible, it's practical, it's possible, and that's basically what the point of this film is. When people walk away from this film, they're going to say, wow, this is possible. This isn't just a pie in the sky. This isn't science fiction. We can do this now. And that's really the feeling that I expect to relay. And the third part of your question is, where do you think the collective consciousness of the human race is headed? That's a loaded word, collective consciousness. I would say that, generally speaking, the human race hopefully will come together in a common goal. And that's what has to happen. There has to be a commonality of intent for humans. Need to be ingrained and supported by education. People want to live. They want to survive. They need clean food, air, and water. They shouldn't be poisoned by industry on a daily basis as we are today. They should recognize this. They should want organic elements. They should want natural culminations of processes. They should want to see themselves survive in the highest level they can in a collective sense. And if that isn't the motivation, if that can't be understood by the survival of the species, it could be considered an evolutionary basis. I think it is a natural stage of evolution, if you will, loosely speaking, that we move into a system of shared values, so to speak, where people finally say, you know what, we're all trying to just live here. Let's harness the planet in the most scientific way we can and provide an abundance for all, which is possible. It's not that we're restricted. And those restrictions that do occur can be overcome by technology, substitutions, and everything else. And again, that's a massive topic. But back to your point, we have to unite in a common goal. So the collective consciousness, you will be for the greater good of the species. And we will all work in that way, in some way or another. And that's there's one thing I wanted to point out. In the Ohio lecture, I made a point about cooperativeness, about how the real argument, I suppose, is that people say that it's against our nature to cooperate, at least holistically. And of course, that's untrue. We see cooperation in pockets. The only unfortunate thing is most of the cooperation we see has to do when there's a common enemy. Military is a classic example. You have a very solid structure of the core, for the greater good of the core. People are working together in a very explicit way, seriously, in the military. But it takes, unfortunately, the motivation to want to attack something else. And that's very twisted. But it does show that in the environment there are grounds for cooperation. Humanity is not constantly at war with itself. And again, there's many different aspects to that. So cooperativeness is there. And what is more sustainable, cooperation or competition? The one example I like to use are ants. If you study ants, like Edward O. Wilson does great ant studies, ants are little biochemical machines. Ants have been around for so long. There are strains of ants that have survived. Their species have been around for millions of years. They do not go extinct. If there's ever a huge nuclear war, there will be bugs and predominantly ants that will only survive. These things are incredible. Why are they so incredible? Because they cooperate. They work holistically. If you watch documentaries on ants, again, I'm not comparing ants to the human species. I'm simply showing that cooperation is what needs to happen. It is the highest reign of sustainability and survival. That's it. I'm going to leave it at that because I'm running out of time here. Anyone who tells you that competition is better than cooperation has done zero research on what nature has shown in feedback. Number 16. This is more of a question for Jacques, but do you think a lecture on the Venus Project and a worldwide resource-based economy at the United Nations conference might be a beneficial result? I think Jacques has mentioned to me that speaking at the United Nations was always a goal. In fact, in the movie that Jacques has advocated, he's mentioned this as the beginning to denote, basically just to show that we do need to address an international community. We also need to understand the United Nations is basically a bunch of self-serving diplomats and bureaucrats that sit in a circle and argue with each other over their own self-interest. There's very little cooperation. The United Nations as a whole, to me, is an absolute joke. But nevertheless, it is an institution where the world is somewhat represented, and hopefully it can be turned around for the better, using science and technology, applying methods. But speaking of the United Nations, by all means. I mean, why not? Why not? I think it'd be wonderful to get Jacques to speak at the United Nations. Number 17. Hello, Peter. I was listening to your old radio shows, and you were answering a question on how the overall money supply is finite and it is impossible for the world to pay all its debt. I think you didn't take into account the fact that banks don't keep the interest part of the money to themselves. They spend it. As an example, if there was only one man and a bank on an empty island, as an example, if there was only one man and a bank on an empty island, now if that man goes and borrows $1,000 from the bank with interest at 10%, then he would be able to pay back the interest part of the money. Sorry, there's a breaks in these sentences. I got to proof these things. Hold on, let me just read this and I'll respond as I summarize it. Okay, basically what they're saying is they make a point that if you're working for the bank, then you can get the interest to pay the money. And this goes back to an idea that was erroneously put forward by G. Edward Griffin. The money doesn't exist. This is what I have to keep saying over and over and over again. While there might be ways to extinguish the money through bank processes, it still doesn't exist. Even if the bank takes it and respends it, it's still money that had to come from somewhere. It either came from loans or it came from other people. So when you take a $1,000 loan and it's paid back, and you get the 10% interest to pay it back, so you pay back $1,100. That whatever that $100 does doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter if it had to come from somewhere, and it doesn't come from the principal. So that's really all I'm going to say about that. Number 18. What role do you see metaphysics playing in the movement? Are you or Jacques aware of integral spirituality and evolutionary spirituality? I think you guys would have some great conversations and active solutions would be created. I feel is if an abundant resource-based economy coupled with principles of metaphysics, mysticism, permaculture, and raw foodism, we could have more of a massive effect. Let me read this. I see a lot of language in this question that I can't quite define. Metaphysics, I understand the early notions of metaphysics, the holistic notions, I believe the Platonic notions. To define metaphysics, it's really beyond the physical, and it typically precludes discoveries of science. So something might be considered metaphysical initially, some pattern that's recognized, and eventually science comes around and makes it, quote, physical. I don't think there's anything else but physical, frankly. I don't see how it's possible. But nevertheless, I think keeping an open mind and you throw out the word mysticism. I have absolutely no use for that word. It has an intangible definition. If it's not tangibly applicable, if it doesn't have feedback from the environment in a way that's actually useful, there's philosophy, and I think philosophy is fantastic. Philosophy precludes all sorts of things that can be eventually applicable. I'm always open-minded. I like to hear people's, even the most what I would call esoteric or, quote, insane views. I'm much more open to people that have esoteric views than solid, rigid academics. I'll say that for sure. So I hope we'll integral spirituality and evolutionary spirituality. I have no idea what that means. I'll try to take a quick glance at the authors that you have pointed out to get a sense of what they're talking about. I frankly can't stand that word spirituality unless they have a quality that's denoting this in a tangible, quantifiable way. I'm typically not interested, but that doesn't mean I'm close to it. So, number 19. And then there's other aspects of that question. I apologize if I skipped elements. If you want to restate that question, I want to move forward. If you want to restate that question, please do so for the next show. Number 19. How would the Zeitgeist Movement Venus Project envision the justice system of the future? When a person is accused of murder or battery or some other crime and guilt must be established, how will this be performed within a resource-based economy? I assume that we would want to utilize the best parts of our current system and presume an offender's innocence until proven guilty. Investigators would most likely be necessary to gather and analyze evidence. How can these jobs be automated? Okay. How will guilt or innocence be determined with all the evidence be fed into a computer, allow a computer to provide a probability of guilt or innocence? Okay, well, first of all, the entire approach to the legal system is very, very different. And I don't quite know in the transition how it will manifest, but in the higher stages of a resource-based economy, when there's no money, so let's say somebody, we'll use a better example. Let's say somebody goes out and finds his girlfriend with somebody else, and he murders the boyfriend of the girl. Now, obviously, that's a very traumatic problem. The individual would need to be, that type of instability of mind would need to be assessed in some way. So they would have to be brought in. Police would be needed in some form for this element. The system as we know it today wouldn't be based, I think, on judgments and persecution in that sense. It would be based on understanding in psychology and sociology. We would apply methods of sociology to try and get to the bottom of the tendency and propensity, and hopefully apply those things to education for the next generation, if you will, or what have you, and to eliminate jealousy and those attributes that continue to be reinforced in this current system, usually by money. We have ownership distortions. People think they own each other. This is my wife. You know that rhetoric. So would the legal system be continued in transition? Probably to a certain degree. So I think what you denote would basically be correct, but that's not our focus. We want to eliminate the source problems, and that's essentially what I'd like to point out. It's It's not a computerized system. I don't think it would work like that. It's because law is completely subjective. It would take a certain value assessment, if you will. But again, the point is to alleviate the problem, not just make laws and imprison people. So if someone kills somebody, we try to figure out why they did it. We try to find the root of it. We try to help them through therapy, not locking them into prisons. That really never works. It's been statistically shown that many people that go into prisons have a high propensity to go back, especially within certain attributes, within certain mediums of incarceration, if you will. So I hope that answers your question. I have 3 minutes left. I'm going to go to number 20. We are working on solutions to bring equality on earth for all. We saw a solution in we, members of destiny.co.na, are working on solutions to bring equality on earth for all. We saw a solution in an equal money system that each gets the same amount of money each month from birth on, so no one has to live in poverty and suffer because of it. Now, it is only a transition because people can't go on, because people can't go from this system to a perfect no money system in just one step. Okay, so you're doing it in a transition. Let me continue. So that's why we propose an equal money system. We are working on the details still. I am interested in anything that might work. My question is, will the Venus Project do what is best for all? Will it stop the control by one elite force, and will it allow all humans to be able to self-express? Also, does it expand on self-honesty to deprogram oneself from programmed behavior? Because the conditions we are into today all originate in our minds and how we are enslaved to them. I'm sorry, I think there were some commas here that were, some periods here that should have been commas. Okay, first of all, an equal money system in transition. I have a hard time thinking about how that would actually work, because even with an equal money system, it implies a form of scarcity. If you're going to go that type of route, and again, you talk about transition, I don't see how it actually works. I think it's better to provide services through government than to develop an equal money system. We obviously have welfare. I think maybe things like holistic salary caps might be a good idea. I find it insane that baseball players can make $12 million a year while we have struggling scientists trying to find cures for disease that were struggling maybe at $50,000 a year, lucky if they can get grants to continue their work. But there's many things I could say about that, but an equal money system, I can't quite see how that would be beneficial, because you might as well just give people access to the resources, if you know what I mean. And there's still the propensity of scarcity. In an equal money system, someone might say, okay, he has this, I have this, I'm going to go steal what they have so I can get more. So it creates a problem. There's still the attribute of crime, still that attribute of coveting other money, because it's inherently going to still be based on the acquisition of resources, not in freedom. It's not a free access, so technology is not being harnessed in the way that we advocate. People should just have access. I can't quite see how that would be transitional, because I know exactly what you're asking me. I think there are certain regulations that can be put forward to help people, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that would work. And as far as the second part of your question, I have 60 seconds left. Also, does it expand on self-honesty to deprogram oneself from programmed behavior? Well, deprogram oneself from aberrated behavior is, of course, a goal of our new system, of all the things that we've expressed. So I'm going to have to stop there, unfortunately, and I apologize for the truncated show. I'm just really exhausted. It's been a tremendously difficult, not difficult, but it's a very tedious couple of days traveling and doing everything. But I'm going to try and get that lecture up as soon as possible. I think it went very well. And that's about it. I really appreciate everybody tuning in again. I'll be back next week with Jock and Roxanne for a full show, and we'll take it from there. So I'll talk to everybody soon. Take care.